I really love medieval France. As I say to today's guest, it just seems much more chic than anyone else's medieval history. In her new book, House of Lilies, historian Justine Firnhaber-Baker charts the rise and fall of the Capetians, the royal dynasty that turned a loose collection of counties and baronies into the France that we recognise today. As well as discussing the strategies of its various kings, Justine and I also talk about whether people in medieval times had a more sophisticated approach to war than we do, the role that antisemitism played in building the early French state, the importance of queens in governing the kingdom, as well as what France's leaders today could learn from the Capetians. Justine and I actually recorded an interview before Christmas, but the audio was too bad to use. In a way, it was a blessing, as this conversation was actually so much more fun. Really hope you enjoy it. Justine, thank you very much for doing this again as our last attempt sort of got mangled technically.
No worries. I'm delighted to talk to you again.
So I'm going to begin by asking, what is your favourite word?
I really like the word crepuscular, which means an adjective. It's like dusk as an adjective. It comes from the French word crépuscule for dusk. It's very descriptive of how that time of day feels. I think the sort of grayish brown with a little bit of purple in it. So I love that word.
What is your least favourite word?
Impact as a verb. Even worse, gift as a verb. There is a perfectly good verb, give. We don't need to say gift. We can say give.
What is your favourite curse word?
I say fuck a lot, but I think actually my go-to is shit.
Nice.
When my oldest was very young, like about 1.5, maybe 2, I broke a glass in the kitchen and she toddled in and she pointed to it and she said, "Shit, mommy, shit." So I think that must actually be my favorite.
Has anything about the Capetians prompted you to use it?
Yeah. Gosh. Yeah, I really think the reign of Philip V, who's the second to last Capetian king, and really a really shady character in a lot of ways. I just felt, well, this is really shitty. Some really shitty things happened here.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
Well, like most people, I like the sound of water. So I like the sound of thunderstorms. I like the sound of rain. I'm lucky enough to live by the sea, so I get waves a lot, and that's really pleasant. Oh, and there's another really nice sound associated with the sea. There are harbors. It's a little string of harbors where I live, and if you walk by them, when the wind is up, you get a really wonderful sound, not just of the wind, but of the metal on sailboats, ropes chiming against the masts, and it makes this wonderful sort of clattering chiming noise with the wind. It's really, you feel outdoors, and like the whole harbor is kind of singing in a way.
I'm in Liverpool, and at night, say quite late at night, maybe like 11, maybe midnight, and I have the window open. Occasionally on the wind, you'll hear the horn of like a tanker. It's
That's
great,
nice.
just like...
Yeah, that sort of lonely sound. Oh, that's
Yeah.
very nice, yes.
What is a sound or noise that you hate?
Um, I really don't like any kind of screech. I mean, most people are like that. I can't think of anything sort of particular. Yeah, loud
Neil,
screeching noises.
were you not a fan then of Screech in Saved by the Bell?
I haven't seen
Oh, you've not seen it?
it.
Do
Sorry.
do you have any guilty pleasures?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm having a dry or damp January, so um, yeah, my evening go-to drink when I get home from work is a bourbon and caffeine-free Diet Coke, which I guess is not that sinful, but I am missing it a little bit at the moment.
What is your favorite book?
Um, okay, so long. I kind of can't pick just one. You know, the first time we did this, I said To Kill a Mockingbird, and I've been thinking about this, and that is actually true. You know, mainly kind of for um, well, the whole story and the character of Scout and Boo Ridley, but also what Atticus says to Scout at the end when Scout says, "Okay, so you say we never had a chance to in this case, so what? So why did you take it? Why did you do this?" And Atticus says, well, you know, there are some causes where even if you've lost 100 years before you start, you still have to fight. And I think that's really important. You see, I get a bit
Uh,
emotional about that, but I think those are words to live by.
uh, especially
Yeah,
as we record this on January 20th.
yeah. Yeah, well, yes, so keep fighting. I mean, the cause is never, everything is struggle, right? Like, and I think you have to just accept that progress is a Sisyphean task, right? You're always going to be rolling up that boulder and it rolls back down sometimes. So, you know, as long as you kind of accept that, you know, that thing about you're not required to finish the work, but neither are you free to abandon it, things we have to keep in mind.
Finally, is there a fictional character who you imagine yourself to be?
No. Actually, I guess maybe Scout in a way. um, no, but not really. No.
So as we touched on last time, medieval France is one of my favourite periods of history. Last year, I sort of discovered the Musée de Cluny and just spent
Oh,
ages just walking around, soaking up the art, the tapestries, the sculptures.
yeah,
I've
I was
also...
there last week. I
Oh,
went
really?
last Sunday. Yeah, and it was just wonderful to touch base with all of it again. I just spent hours, even though I'd been there a couple of times
Yeah.
before. More.
I've also been desperate to visit Saint-Chapelle, which you talk about in House of Lilies. But it's always been busy, like when I've tried to go. Like the queue just going all around, around, around.
Yeah.
Um, so I was going to start by asking, what was it that drew you to medieval France?
Hmm. Um. Well, okay. Something that is maybe not generally known is that in order to become a medievalist, you need languages. And you cannot even get into a postgraduate program to do a PhD unless you already have languages. And I took a couple of years out between my first degree and going back to do my postgraduate. And I was just working for a software company during that time. But one of the things I did was to start French. So it's actually kind of funny. I didn't have French until actually after my first degree. Um, and it just happened that it was also really cheap to fly to Paris at that time. I was living in Chicago at the time. Um, so I'd started French with an eye to going to graduate school. And then I went to Paris for the first time. And I didn't expect to fall in love, you know, because it's such a, you know, everybody loves Paris, right? It's like, what could possibly be the big deal about Paris? But of course, I fell in love with Paris, and really having a reasonable standard of French, along with Latin and some German, meant that I could get into graduate school, and it just became kind of a sensible thing to do. And I had also been told by my first ever European history teacher, who was studying for his PhD at the time, that if you want to become a historian, you should think about where you want to spend a lot of time and study that. So a lot of things came together to make France the obvious choice.
I mean, I always believed that I was a Francophile, but up until this time last year, I'd never actually been to France.
Oh.
So, like, I loved French history, French films, French TV shows, French literature, but I just never been. And then about this time last year, I decided to just do a big solo trip, and
Uh-huh.
so it was going to be train to Paris, a few days in Paris, train to Barcelona, then train to Avignon, and then back to Paris.
Right.
And when I arrived in Paris, it was immediate falling in love. Just everything, just the whole atmosphere. And I think my hotel was about nearly an hour's walk away from Gare du Nord.
Uh-huh.
But I just walked the whole way and was just taking pictures, and just everything about it just made me fall in love. And then when I got to Barcelona, I was just like, this isn't Paris. Yeah.
So did you go back, or did...
Yeah, well, so I've now, well, after not going to France at all in the last year, I've been to Paris 3 times.
Right.
Yeah, and so I'm planning on doing more this year. I also think with French medieval history, like everything else French, it seems much more chic than medieval English medieval history.
Well, I think so. Yeah, it's kind of funny how it's very funny having published House of Lilies pretty much simultaneously, a couple months apart in the UK and the US, because my American readers don't really have any priors. It's just medieval to them. And I grew up in the US, so like I completely understand. Like, yeah, Britain is a little bit, we know it's kind of different, but now I've lived in Britain and mainly in Scotland for the last 17 years. I know how different. But in Britain, and particularly in England, there absolutely this very firm, thick foundation of English medieval history from which people approach my book. And it's very interesting to see the sort of range of reactions, which kind of ranges from, well, there isn't as much as I would have thought about Richard the Lionhearted in this, to, oh, wow, okay, this is really cool. This makes a lot of stuff that I didn't know about beforehand make a lot more sense. And, there's this kind of uncomfortable fact in medieval history from an Anglophone and particularly English perspective that France was really where it was at in the Middle Ages. I mean, England is really kind of a sideshow, and even a lot of the English kings kind of knew that.
I did medieval history as part of my undergrad degree,
Uh-huh.
but it was very much English medieval history. And insofar as France appeared, it was either Edward the and Gascony, or it was John losing most of the Angevin Empire, and then
Yeah.
after that, it's as though France ceased to exist.
Yes. Well, it's very funny sometimes reading Anglophone historians of the Angevin Empire. It's like there's sort of, the King of France is sort of off there somewhere. And sometimes the King of France is not even named, right? And I kind of wonder, like, Do you know that Philip Augustus was a very different character to Louis VII? A lot kind of changes within this sort of homogenous entity that is just kind of referred to here as France, and that Normandy is fully part of France during that period. So yeah, it's interesting coming at um, everybody's priors and even a lot of academic medieval historiography from my perspective, which of course is not only as a historian of France, but also as someone who was trained in the American system. So my priors are completely different.
So your book, House of Lilies, is about the Capetian dynasty of France, if listeners hadn't guessed that already. I wondered if you could give an overview of who they were.
Okay, so the Capetian dynasty ruled France from, so our official dates are 987 to 1328. Now, you might sometimes read that the Capetians ruled France from 987 up until the French Revolution. And in a way, that's true because their later descendants did, there is a biological and mostly patrilineal line of succession there. But 987 to 1328 is the direct line of father to son, and at the very end, brother to brother succession. It is in 1328 that direct line ends. And as the chronicles say, at the time the crown passes in the transverse line to Philip of Valois, who medieval historians regard as starting a new dynasty, the Valois, about whom I am currently writing another book. So stay tuned for that. 987, also a little bit of an artificial date. That's the date that the man whom we regard as the dynasty's founder, his name was Hugh. We now also call him Capet, by a nickname he was given after his death. So it's Hugh of the Short Cloak, Capet. This nickname actually was probably that of his father, a man we now refer to as Hugh the Great. This short cloak of Hugh's might actually refer to a short cloak. It might actually refer to the family's relationship to the Church of St. Martin of Tours, who's St. Martin famously gives half his cloak to a beggar. But the dynasty doesn't really start to be called that until the French Revolution, when the last of these descendants, before the Restoration, was sentenced to die at the guillotine, and they wanted to give him a surname, a last name, like any other French citizen would have, right? In this new egalitarian regime. So they called him after the family's founder. So he went to the guillotine as Louis Capet.
I love that story because I didn't know it until I read your book.
So Hugh is kind of, even in the Middle Ages, and indeed very quickly, he was kind of regarded as a usurper, because France, the territory we now call France, which at that point was called West Francia, had been part of the empire of Charlemagne, the Carolingian Empire. And it had, its two most recent rulers had been his descendants, called Carolingians. So there's this idea that West Francia properly belonged to the Carolingians, and Hugh took it away from him, and his family kept it. But actually, Hugh was not even the first of his family to be king of West Francia. He was actually the fourth. And his family, whom we actually call the Robertine after their founder, Robert the Strong, kind of traded the West Frankish throne back and forth with Carolingians for over 100 years. 99 years, at the point when Hugh is chosen king of the Franks for lack of a direct male descendant of the last Carolingian king, who was 18 years old when he died in a hunting accident. He didn't leave any children. He had actually been married, but had already managed to get himself divorced by then. So there's actually nothing shady about Hugh's accession to the throne. But this story quickly arises because there is a Carolingian competitor. And of course, there were people in West Francia who didn't really like Hugh Capet and his family, and threw everything they had against them.
And something that also surprised me is that this story was so sensitive that for hundreds of years, Capetian kings didn't dare name any of their children Charles because it might give legitimacy to the Carolingian.
Yeah, they just stay away from this name. And it's so funny because now we think of Charles as a very normal French king's name, right? In this follow-up book I'm writing on the Valois dynasty, let's see, Charles V, Charles VI, Charles VII, and Charles VIII. So 4 of the 7 kings involved are named Charles, right? It becomes very normal. But the Capetians do not use it for any of their children until 1229. So they've been on the throne for a long time. And even that child, Charles of Anjou, who's going to grow up to be king of Sicily and Jerusalem, is named after the death of his father. So it's his mother who names him. So maybe she's feeling a little bit more daring than her late husband would have allowed. And then the only Capetian king we get named Charles, the first one, is also the last one, Charles IV, who dies in 1328 without a male heir to succeed him.
You already kind of touched on this, but I feel like a lot of people sort of see history backwards, and we know what France looks like geographically today, and we tend to assess how like this event or that decision led to its current form. But what kind of kingdom did the Capetians imagine they were building?
What kind of... Let's start out with what they had, and then we can think about what they thought they might be moving to. So what they had was a sort of loose federation of great baronies. West Francia was, I don't know about exact area, but it might be a little bit bigger than France today because it didn't include Provence, but it did include Catalonia. And it also included Flanders, which is today Belgium, part of Belgium. Sorry, Walloons. Flanders is not the only part of Belgium. But this territory was not homogenous. People didn't speak the same language, they didn't follow the same laws, and they certainly didn't do what the king told them to do. And the king did not expect that from them either. And in fact, a lot of these people, the rulers of the great baronies, so someone like the Count of Anjou, the Duke of Normandy, the Count of Toulouse, the Duke of Aquitaine, they expect to be treated almost as equals to the king. They do not expect, for example, to pay any taxes to the king. They do expect to have to show up if the king is in need of their counsel, and maybe even in need of their troops. But for the most part, most of the what we might call politics that goes on is not external. So the king of West Francia has a very troubled relationship with the emperor, in what is now Germany. But most of his energy is directed at making alliances, or in lieu of alliances, making war against the other great barons of his kingdom, because everybody is jockeying for territory all the time. So it's very messy. Now, we kind of look at this from a modern perspective and say, oh, that's a terrible mess. But that's not what they thought at the time. Like, to us, it looks like chaos, and to them, it looks like Tuesday, right? So where we end up in 1328 is with a much more centralized, really, state. People do talk about a medieval state, or certainly the medieval origins of the modern state, in the 13th and 14th century. And a lot of where they're looking at for evidence for this is France, because France centralizes to a greater degree than almost anywhere than, say, England, though England is a very different case. Much easier to centralize in England, not least because you conquer it and then you do whatever you want with it. The Capetian kings are conquering some of their territory, but most of it already kind of belongs to them. So they kind of have to deal with what they find on the ground. Now, they do have a different status to these quarrelsome barons who are ruling most of their territory, because they are anointed as kings. They're anointed with a holy chrism. So that actually, in the French king's case, is thought to literally come from heaven. So that gives them a very special status in this kingdom that is very Christian, and Christian in a sense that they are eating and drinking and breathing Christianity. It's a bit like religion is not a separate thing in the Middle Ages. Now we think about people who are religious and who are religiously observant. That's not the same in the Middle Ages, because it's not really a choice. It's just like what you are. Like, medieval Christians think about being Christian as essentially the same as being human, right? It's just what you do. And really, that what we would call religious viewpoint is really central to what the Capetians are thinking of when they're thinking about where they want their kingdom to go. What they want is eventually to sort of build a new Jerusalem on earth. I mean, they think about themselves as a chosen people, not just Christians as a new chosen people, but specifically the French as a new chosen people. And this whole sort of rhetoric of France as the new Israel, Paris as the new Jerusalem, and even a better place than Jerusalem kind of grows up. And so the really foundational document of French government is this ordinance that King Louis IX promulgates when he comes back from a very unsuccessful crusade. He thinks that this crusade has been unsuccessful because he and his people are sinful. So he reforms his government top to bottom to root out corruption and to make it moral. And this is the document that really becomes the touchstone for the next at least couple of 100 years. People talk about, okay, well, we need to get our government back to what was done in the time of good Saint Louis. Louis IX eventually becomes sainted. And they use this foundational document as basically the constitution for French monarchical government. But it's not a political document in our sense. It's a religious document, but that's not a difference for them. That is the same thing for them.
Something which really interests me about the early Capetians is that, I guess the environment that they operated in, I would say, is sort of more understandable to us because it's more political than, say, an absolute monarch that can just decree. Whereas, these early kings had to sort of leverage relationships, maneuver, win people over, threaten. And for anyone who's, watches anything like Succession or sort of House of Cards or anything like that, those early Capetians, I think, could seem more understandable because it's much more wheeler dealer
Yeah.
than just a king decreeing X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, one of the first things I tell my students about medieval political history is there is no such thing as absolute monarchy in the Middle Ages. And that's not just about logistics. Like, it's very hard to just decree something when the roads are bad and you don't have the taxes to employ a big salaried bureaucracy, but it's also ideological. Kings are meant to rule in cooperation with the other great men and women, and very much women, of the kingdom. They are not meant to do just whatever they please. And indeed, in medieval political philosophy, that kind of absolute, I will now just decree that those documents are unclassified or whatever, is that kind of ruling by decree is considered tyranny, and it is actually thought to be a defensible reason for regicide. So there is no sense in which a medieval king can just do whatever he wants. It is meant to be cooperative. And the other thing that is a really important medieval political value is the common good. And we see that kind of language, well, it's really inherited from Rome and the idea of the res publica, the public thing, which we now translate as republic. But it literally means the public thing. And people talk about the public good, the common good, the public thing. And that is what medieval rulership is for, the safeguarding of the common good. So there are a lot of constraints on medieval rulers. And of course, this constraint of being certainly chosen by God for this, but that while that gives you rights, it also comes with huge responsibilities. And medieval rulers do very much feel that weight of being God's representative on earth and needing to rule justly and morally.
Now, related to this idea of like leveraging relationships and stuff, I think when people think of like medieval warfare, they imagine these battles like Cressy or Agincourt.
Yeah.
But a great point that you made in the book is that a lot of medieval warfare is quite boring, sort of tedious sieges and stuff. And that's because, as you say, that the key thing is to get your opponent to the negotiation table and strike a deal. Because it's not about a sort of total victory or winner takes all. It's this person could be my ally the next day or the next week. So how can I get them to the table, strike a deal, and work on the next thing?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think in some ways, medieval people had a much more sophisticated approach to enmity and conflict than we do. And I'm not saying they didn't have, sort of implacable hatreds. And we see very early on ideas of nationhood, as I was talking about, and those obviously also entail sort of othering people like the English. But the medieval elites are incredibly intertwined also. So, everybody's married to one another. Everybody's related to one another. And they do not have much of an idea of winner take all in conflict, not least because, again, the sort of lack of enforcement mechanisms. You can win a case in court, but who's gonna enforce it a lot of times? So often what people really look for in the courtroom, in the legal sphere anyway, as well as in warfare, is to find a compromise, something that is going to durably reconcile both parties. And that does mean sometimes also that someone will make a claim that he or she knows cannot be supported. Like, the very famous one would be Edward III saying he was King of France. Well, he had lived 12 years without claiming he was King of France by 1340 when he finally makes that claim. And he gives it up very easily. But, so that's sort of looking for leverage. So you could make a crazy claim, or that, at least a claim would be hard to not acceptable. Or you could do something like go burn a bunch of your enemy's villages down. So that's lots of fun because one, you can get lots of booty, and two, that makes your enemy look like a weakling because he or she has not managed to protect those villages, and that's part of his or her duty as a lord. So there are lots of different ways to apply pressure to your enemy that do not involve meeting in battle, because everybody knows that in battle anything can happen. And indeed, a couple of times that does go very well for the Capetians. In a way, it does not necessarily go very well for the successors, the Valois.
I mean, this sort of leads into, I guess, the guy who dominates a lot of the book and also dominates a lot of French history, which is Philip Augustus. And as I said, like, he isn't that well known in Britain, even though he basically destroyed the Anglo-Norman Empire. So I wondered if you could sort of explain more about him and also his approach as a strategist.
Yes. Okay. So Philip Augustus ruled France from 1180 to 1223. And that just reminds me that I gave the date of Charles of Anjou's birth wrong. It was late 1226, not 1229. Philip Augustus inherited the throne of France at the age of 15. He had no regency. He just started ruling as a 15-year-old. France had been greatly reduced in terms of power and also territory by first Norman, and then by 1180 we are into the Plantagenets. And it was a much poorer kingdom. It was not a necessarily less prestigious kingdom, not least because of the sort of religious authority of the French kings and particularly the behavior of Philip Augustus's father, Louis VII, who listeners might know of as the first unfortunate husband of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Philip is faced with Henry II in England, who's a man much older than him, and of course married to his father's ex-wife, who has lots of sons. Philip is his father's only son and born quite late. Henry II is much richer. He has a much larger army, but over the next really 25, 30 years, Philip turns that on its head. It is Philip who destroys the Angevin Empire on the continent, who takes Normandy, this crown jewel of the Angevin Empire, because it is where they started out, but also the Western territories, Anjou, which is where Henry Plantagenet is from, and a lot of the south as well. So they are kind of only left with this rump of Eleanor's dowry. So they don't even have most of Aquitaine. They're sort of left with this rump that is Gascony. And he does that through warfare. He's great on the battlefield. Philip was kind of a strange guy in a lot of ways, but one thing Philip was good at was warfare. But the other thing is that he absolutely reorganizes his government. This is so that he can go on crusade. And unlike his grandson, Louis IX, who reorganizes it on very much a religious basis, Philip reorganizes his on the basis of accountability. He wants to know what is happening in all of his lands, and he sets up a system of reporting so that his officers, and he now really kind of has officers, so like actual official representatives of government, not just some guys who are off doing things, who come in and they report centrally. And then those reports get sent to Philip on crusade. So it's a completely different, much more centralized idea about government. And Philip also knows, and he says this in so many words, that you have to have money in order to have troops so that you can rule your lands. So he is very, and people at the time thought he was really avaricious, but he is very careful about his budget, and he is absolutely keen to maximize every source of revenue possible. I should say, however, that does, before we get too positive about Philip Augustus, that does involve expropriating and for a while expelling the Jews of France, whose property he wants to take for the crown. And even when he brings them back in, there's a sort of effectively system of taxation that that the crown sets up to skim some of the profit off of Jewish lending.
I mean, it reminds me of, well, I mean, I was going to say that when you mentioned about French nationhood and othering, sort of recurring thing in the book is not only the English, but also Jews sort of painted as another. And I mean, and an analogy I loved about Philip Augustus was you sort of say how before he'd place like a fresh geopolitical bet, he'd count his winnings from the last one, and was very cautious that way.
Yes, Philip was a really good strategist. He did not overextend himself. He was essentially what he did that allowed France to absorb the Languedoc, southern France, which was sort of officially part of the kingdom, but also like kind of did its own thing. But by the end of Philip's reign, that is part of France, and it's his son, Louis VIII, who only rules France for 3 years, but he completes this conquest. So the absorption of the Languedoc happens through a crusade called the Albigensian Crusade, which is a crusade launched within France, what is now France, against these heretics known as Albigensians from the city of Albi, where they were thought to be strong. And it is northern French, led by a guy named Simon de Montfort. But then Simon de Montfort dies, and his son is not really up to the job. And so the French crown kind of takes it over. So like Simon de Montfort does all the hard work, and then Louis VIII kind of swoops in there at the end. So it's a wonderful example of Philip not overextending himself. You know, when the Albigensian Crusade is launched in 1209, he has just gotten Normandy from John in 1204, but it's not complete yet. It's really not until the Battle of Bouvines in 1214 when Philip does fight a battle, and very successfully, and this wonderful battle whose the victory kind of echoes down through the centuries. But it's not until that battle that he's really secure. So I think he's quite right not to get distracted by the Albigensian Crusade. Another thing that happens during Philip's reign is his son Louis decides to go and invade England, which he kind of has a right to, by right of his wife, who is Plantagenet in the maternal line. But, and that might have it went very successfully for a while until John dies, and the English barons are like, actually, we will have 8-year-old Henry III. Thank you very much. We can control him much better than we can control John. But Philip Augustus, it's very unclear whether he even approved of that. He certainly did not approve of it when it all went pear-shaped, and he would just like not even talk to his son when it all went pear-shaped. Louis's wife had to organize a sort of rescue mission, which didn't come to anything. So yeah, he's a very careful king. I mean, he is one of my favorites, although he's a very unpleasant person in many ways.
Well, what's quite funny is so the second season will be kicking off this week with a talk about James Bond and strategy. And a big chunk of the discussion is how Timothy Dalton is underappreciated as a Bond. Also, one of my favourite Timothy Dalton performances is as Philip Augustus in The Lion in Winter. As a particular bit where sort of Peter O'Toole's Henry II says to Philip, "You're much better at this than I thought." Yeah, so it's a nice dovetail, I thought.
Yes, if you're any of you listening out there have not seen A Lion in Winter, I promise you, it's worth it. I know it's old. It's kind of long too, but it's absolutely worth it. Although you might, if you don't know about this period of history, maybe read House of Lilies first and then watch A Lion in Winter. I always show it to my students, and they like roll about the place laughing.
It is one of my favorites. It also has one of my favorite sort of strategy truisms was when Peter O'Toole's Henry II and Timothy Dalton's Philip are having a back and forth about territories, and Philip says, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do this. And Henry just decides to end the meeting, and Philip is like surprised. I was like, why are you ending the meeting? And Henry says, because you've burbled every bit of strategy you've got. So now I know exactly what you're going to do. So I'm gonna get off.
But another thing that Timothy Dalton says during that film to Henry is, "I have time," and that very much kind of proved to be the case. The thing about Henry II, he was a lot stronger than Philip Augustus. He was also a lot older. And those sons of his, did not end up covering themselves in glory. Though Richard would have been okay had it not been for the unlucky crossbow in 1199. He would have been okay. I think that Philip would have had a lot to deal with Richard. But bad luck.
Although there might have been the whole acrimony from, with your ex.
Yes.
Allegedly.
Yeah, you're talking about Alice.
Oh, I meant the alleged rumors about Richard and Philip.
Oh, yes, about Richard. Yes, how they used to sleep in the same bed, and yes, and we're so. Yes, they really loved each other until Henry II died, and then it turned out that a lot of what they had in common was that they really hated Henry II. But were they romantic with each other? Were they sexual with each other? Who knows? I mean, Philip Augustus' sexuality is, even with women, Philip Augustus' sexuality is really quite a question. I mean, there's an entire chapter in House of Lilies about basically whether or not he had sex with his second wife, which sounds like, well, that's a really weird thing to write a whole chapter on. But it actually mattered a lot, both in terms of the development of the kingdom, but also in terms of the development of the church's laws on marriage, because this was a real test case for a very important pope called Innocent III. So it is actually... It is not a titillating aside. It is actually very central to the development, to historical development.
I mean, this touches on something else that really surprised me in House of Lilies, which is the expectation that the wives of kings would be quote unquote political partners.
Yep.
I was sort of curious, what were the political opportunities for these women, and what limits did they hit up against?
Okay, so yes. Um, the queens are really important, and even occasionally some princesses, like Louis IX's daughter, Isabella of France. She just goes off and does her own thing, including like saying, no, I'm not going to marry the emperor's son. Thanks very much. I'm going to find a nunnery instead. First of all, these women are often great baronesses in their own rights. They often control large territories. They often have their own troops. They certainly have their own wealth. They have their own family connections. They are expected, not allowed, but expected to rule on their husband's behalf anytime that he is absent. They're not there for decoration. They are not there for emotional support. They are there to make alliances. They are there to give advice. A silly woman is not going to make a good queen. They are very much there for childbearing. That absolutely. But once a queen has proven herself by producing an heir, she's going to really be able to acquire quite a lot of power, particularly if she ends up surviving her husband to be part of her son's reign. And the biggest example here, of course, is Blanche of Castile, who rules as Louis IX's regent when he inherits the throne at 12 years old. And in a sense, she never really stops being regent until she dies in 1252. Louis comes to the throne in 1226, right? She has another period of official regency when he goes on crusade, but she's always there. And during the first regency, when he's young, she's responsible for some of the really important innovations in the 13th century. So it is Blanche of Castile who negotiates the treaty that actually makes the county of Toulouse, acquired during the Albigensian Crusade, part of the Kingdom of France ultimately. It is under Blanche that we get what's called the first piece of royal legislation in France. The first royal promulgation that is binding on everyone. Whereas before, what we get are royal promulgations, but it's about who has consented to this. So they are expected to be part of the political scene, but there are absolutely limitations. One, they can't inherit the throne. Now, this is not tested until 1316, the first time that a Capetian king dies without a male heir of his body. It's certainly implicit before that. Women hold lots of other baronies, they hold lots of other thrones around Europe. But Capetian kingship is a very male thing. It also very much depends, well, one, on that producing of a male heir. So, Eleanor of Aquitaine would never have married Henry II had she given Louis VII a son. With Louis VII, she only had 2 daughters in, I can't remember how many years of marriage, but well over a decade, right? Maybe even close to over 15. If she'd had a son, Louis never would have wanted to divorce her, but Louis needed a male heir. And this is another reason why, one of those reasons that I think that the expectation of a male heir was always pretty implicit there. It also sometimes it depends on the relationship with the husband as well. One of the later Capetian kings, Philip the Fair, Philip IV, who rules from 1285 to 1314, and his wife, Joan of Navarre-Champagne, had very distant final years. And it doesn't look like Joan had a lot of influence on Philip in those final years. So she did kind of get some revenge by producing a secret will that Philip had to abide by after her death, even though he didn't want to. But earlier on, even when the relationship was very frosty, as it was between the second Capetian king, Robert the Pious, and his wife, Constance of Arles. I mean, those two hated each other. So this is in the early 11th century. I mean, Constance just did her own thing. You know, she would go so far as to make alliances with her husband's enemies, and yeah, it's kind of like Eleanor of Aquitaine prefigured. Raise a rebellion with her sons against her husband. So, you know, there is a lot of room for maneuver there.
I mean, I did enjoy the whole Real Housewives-esque feud between Constance and the other wife, Bertha.
Oh, yeah, Bertrada, yes, yes. Yeah, because Bertrada is still kind of there the whole time. The Pope makes Robert and Bertrada break up because they are too closely related. But they had gotten together despite the disapproval of Robert's father, and despite a lot of people thinking this was not a good idea. But it takes a long time for Robert and Bertrada to accept that. And even once they do, and even once Robert is remarried, Bertrada is still. There's even one point at which it seems like Robert might annul the marriage with Constance and return to Bertrada, but that doesn't go anywhere. Constance and Robert stay married, and Bertrada stays frustrated. It's kind of a sad story.
So, the restoration of Notre Dame was completed in December. Did you manage to go?
I'm so embarrassed to say I didn't. I kept meaning to go, and then and I was going to go the last the day before I left, and I got really absorbed in the writing I'm doing on the second book, and I didn't actually realize that I had missed my chance to go until I was already on the train to Italy the next day. So, but I mean, I will have to go back, right?
Well, I mean, given that there's so much French history jostling for attention, whether it's like the World Wars, the Revolution, Napoleon, the reopening of Notre Dame made me curious about how do the French regard the Capetians today?
Yes. I mean, it's a bit like the Plantagenets for the English, though. Okay, so it's something that, although maybe less so, because there's definitely a sense that the Capetians were a thing. And, you know, of course, history buffs in France will know about the Capetians, the same way that history buffs in England will know about the Plantagenets. Your average French person will be able to name certainly Hugh Capet, certainly Saint Louis, Louis IX, maybe Philip Augustus, and maybe Louis the Fat, but just because, you know, it's so funny, his name is Louis the Fat, you know, so it's sort of for the same reason my students always remember Louis the Fat. But whereas in England, you have a sense of continuity because we still have a monarchy. In France, there is that real break with the revolution. And there is a real kind of, and there's also the real sense of the tight relationship between the pre-revolutionary monarchy and the pre-revolutionary Catholic Church, right? So it took me a while to realize this when I was first studying French medieval history as a postgraduate, 20 more years ago. It's not necessarily a right-wing thing, but it is a vision of France that can lend itself to a nostalgic, exclusionary, Christian nationalist interpretation of the identity of France. And that's one thing that I was very conscious of while writing the book, to make clear, one, that I know about this, and that the book is not an endorsement of that interpretation of French identity. Modern French identity is so much more than the Capetians. I mean, I think there is a place for the Capetians in modern French identity, but I think that Capetian history raises a lot of questions. Louis IX is often seen as this kind of glorious apogee of French nationhood. There is a lot of dark side to Saint Louis in terms of his persecution. And when you go to the Sainte-Chapelle, having read my book, you will go with my chapter on the Sainte-Chapelle in mind. The Sainte-Chapelle is glorious, and it is the story in the stained glass windows, which you walked into it, and it's supposed to be like walking into heaven, and it does feel celestial. The stories in the glass are a story of salvation history, from the creation of the world to the apocalypse. The last window, the last stop on that trip to the apocalypse is the Capetians, right? So yeah, that's kind of funny. But the stories in the glass are all from the Old Testament, right? So it's Jewish history. There is nothing in those windows that marks out the people in them as Jewish to a medieval eye. So there's essentially a kind of erasure, right? And that Louis was very anti-Semitic, and he is also, he is absolutely a Crusader king, right? And he really thought that maybe, so his first crusade went to Egypt as sort of, you go there and that's where the Sultanate is based, and that's how you'll get to Jerusalem. But he thought that he might actually kind of annex Egypt. And, it was a sort of imperial venture, which Napoleon was absolutely aware of, by the way, this precursor situation. So there's a lot that is very not admirable about the Capetians. And that is still, these are still questions that contemporary French people are grappling with. And trying to figure out, okay, how do we become a multicultural and tolerant nation with this also in the country's DNA?
I mean, that brings me to my last question, which is if you think there's anything France's current leaders could learn from the Capetians.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they would do better to imitate a sort of Robert the Pious rather than Louis XIV, and try listening and cooperating more than decreeing. Although actually even now scholars of quote unquote absolutism say, oh, this is much more a cooperative project than one imposed from the top down. But yeah, I think the sort of attempt to be an absolutist president, I don't know, it worked for de Gaulle, but I think it's ultimately going to founder on the great variety within France. And if you try to impose homogeneity on it, you're not going to get anywhere. And also, you just have to, you have to deal with the fact that the French are going to protest, right? I remember once I went to the archives near Christmas time to find that they were en grève, they were on strike. And I took a pamphlet to find out what the strike was about. And it was because they were closed because the workers were angry that they were getting Christmas bonuses. So, I don't know, maybe France is just ungovernable, right?
Justine, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It was really nice to talk to you again. I enjoyed this even more the second time.
Me too. I want to thank Justine again for sparing the time. If you enjoyed our conversation, please like, rate, comment, etc. If you would like to buy House of Lilies and support independent stores in the UK, visit the Strategy Hour and Bookshop page. The link is in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to mine and Justine's socials. As I said last week, I have so many great guests lined up for the pod, so I really hope you all tune in again next week.